working on this film in particular and issues around immigration?
Sure. So I've been, I started as a journalist, as a writer, and was also very interested in policy issues. So after I went to Cornell, and after I graduated, my first job was at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., which was a place where I started to see sort of how policy and politics and lived experience really shape each other very, very firmly. And when I was there, I was actually part of a radio show responding to the first Gulf War. And I realized that I didn't have the skills at that time to really be an effective communicator and to, ideally help to shape how people frame issues or think about issues. So that led me eventually to get a master's degree at Columbia in the School of Journalism. And that's really where I started to dip my fingers into film. And what I discovered was that in my experience, I think film making, visual media, is really powerful in connecting not just on a policy level or a factual level, but on an emotional level. And my feeling over these last 20 years is that the most successful films tend to be those that allow you to connect with people who you might or might not otherwise connect with through a lived experience. Through most of the kinds of films that I make aren't really what we call sort of the standard PBS talking head films, but they're sort of films where you're with people in their lives and you see the context of their lives and you see their communities. And I think that grounds this kind of work in a kind of meaning that the viewers can experience and feel as well as understand. So your second question, this film in particular was actually a commissioned film. I was invited to participate in the film by the two executive producers who were raising money to do it. And at the time, it actually started out as a film about Mexican-American history. But as we were developing the project, it occurred to me that history was unfolding all around us and that the intersection between particularly Mexican migrants and American culture has its roots in both countries and that people are constantly going back and forth. And in that journey back and forth, there's a lot of experience that informs both the lives of the migrants and also there are structural reasons why people decided to stay. So this film, which one of our executive producers is a historian named Enrique Krause, a Mexican historian who's very well known for his histories in Mexico, was an attempt to both depict the lived experience of people in that moment, 2016, 2015, 2016 really, and also provide enough historical context that people could come away hopefully knowing much more about the subject. And ideally, the film was released literally just 6 weeks before the election in 2016. And I think we're also sort of activist filmmakers, and the hope was that we could help to shape some of the debate around immigration. And also, the 2016 election was very much about immigration and about the place of the other. And as we all know, Trump took a very hostile and aggressive stance in relationship to immigrants, particularly Mexican immigrants, but certainly across the board. So curious as to your reactions and thoughts about the film after the Trump era. I screened the film a number of times during the Trump era, and it really played very differently than it did before he was elected. And perhaps now at a time of hope, it plays again a little differently. So
yeah,
eager to answer any questions you guys might have. Maybe we should watch the film, then we could talk about it afterwards. But
yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think, saying that history is around us is a really poignant observation. I think kind of looking at a larger scale and kind of thinking about some of your other work and titles, which include issues around environmental justice, LGBTQ issues, Islamophobia, xenophobia. You've worked on a lot of different projects across the years. Kind of at 30,000 feet, how do you see these issues kind of being connected? And then how does that kind of fit into this piece on immigration?
It's a great question. I think if I can come up with a good answer. A lot of the films that I've worked on have touched on public health and the environment and politics or social politics. And I think, it's a pleasure to be, at Hopkins. One of the earlier projects that I did was actually, I was part of an ABC News project that embedded at the teaching hospital and made a film about the experience of residents and people coming through the hospital. Um, I think really in some ways, all these films are about public health in a way. My angle into LGBT was really through HIV/AIDS and asking the question, why are these most vulnerable communities, depending on what country you're looking in, always the most vulnerable communities, and why did they have the highest HIV infection rates? That led to a film that came out of Jamaica eventually, which looked at LGBT issues, but was framed by this context of, who is the most vulnerable and why? What are the cultural factors? I think that's true for environmental justice stories as well. Now as we talk about migrants and economic migrants, I think in the last year or two or three, the topic has turned towards environmental migrants, right? As we see what's driving people really, out of Central America, out of South America, as these flows really start to move, you see it in Bangladesh, you see it across Asia, again, they're political issues framed by this shared experience of climate change, which many people still can't quite see yet and can't quite make the connections. In the same way, I guess, immigration from Mexico really, started as very much a core economic question. And then it evolves as the two cultures sort of grow together and over, 70 years of shared experience or 80 or 90 years of shared experience. And again, from a public health perspective, again, of course, who are the most vulnerable? Who are the people now suffering from COVID? Why is the Latino population, some of the hardest hit? I think, again, these structural issues inform how people live, and that the shaping of the contours of those experiences also really determine how healthy you are and what opportunities you have. And I take a very I worked with a friend from worked with PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, for a couple of years, and he always defined health not as sickness, but as the absence of illness and the opportunity to really fulfill your abilities and your dreams. And I guess I take that more expansive look at health and public health. So that's some thoughts about what connects all these different pieces.
Yeah, I think that that's a great point, and sorry for the sirens, but I think that that was kind of the goal of this series on immigration, was kind of thinking about how we can expand our definitions of health, and hopefully we can kind of get into more of that discussion after the film screening. But I hope that this has kind of framed and set this up very well. So I will be sharing my screen at this point so we can.
Can I ask one question? Just, is
Yes.
everybody here from Hopkins in public health, or where are people coming to this film from? I'd be really just curious if people could just introduce themselves really quickly. I know we don't want to take too much time, but I'd love to hear who you guys are. Jump in. I could call a name. Gabby?
Hi, my name is Gabby Hedrick, and I'm a PhD student in the Human Nutrition program at Johns Hopkins. And some of my research focuses on immigrant health and immigrant access to food, especially with lack of access to the social safety net here.
Great. Thanks. Catherine?
Yeah, hi, I'm Kathy Axe, and I'm the Executive Director of Student Disability Services. So I work university-wide with all the schools. And again, we work with students with many intersecting needs. And so just trying to better understand a little bit about the experience some of our students could be having.
Yeah. Lydia, let me ask you to call on people. I feel like I'm falling into my SVA persona too much.
Yeah, I think that most people are from the School of Public Health. and certainly from all from Hopkins, I believe, but anyone feel free to jump in and correct me if I'm wrong. But exciting, I feel like we have a lot of different people within public health, so working on lots of different focus areas. We have Jordan, who's an MPH MBA student, so that's really interesting. Ashley is in the MPH program. So yeah, I would say a lot of people are public health, but kind of working in different fields within that. But I think with that, I think that kind of set us up to go into.
Wait a minute, Kayla, if I said that right, and Anne both turn on their cameras. So who are you guys from?
Hi, thanks for being here. I'm Annie Martin. I'm in the epidemiology department. I'm a PhD, a doctoral student, and I don't do any specific research on this topic. I do research largely in malaria, but I'm just very interested in the film and the work and the cause. So thanks for being here.
Kayla?
And I'm Kiara Jacques. I'm sorry, I'm sitting outside, so there's lots of background noise, but I'm one of the assistant directors with Source, and just turn my camera on in solidarity and celebrating that Lydia's brought us all together. So also at the School of Public Health.
Great, thank you so much.
Hi there. I don't have my camera on. I apologize. I'm Kristen Preheim. I'm a part-time MPH student here. I'm a pharmacist. I'm originally from El Paso. And I am, I've got family members who are immigrants, and I just have a personal interest in this area.
Great. Okay, great. Well, thank you guys. I've often thought about getting an MPH, but never quite got around to it. Lydia, back to you.
Okay, yeah, thank you all for introducing yourselves. And I will definitely have more time and room for discussion after the film. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. And please fix things, but yeah, I wasn't sure if anyone had any questions. Feel free to also add them into the chat. If not, one of the things that I wanted to ask about was in the last scenes, they kind of started talking about DAPA, and kind of over the course of the past few years, although DACA has had a lot of public approval and kind of has been pretty popular widely, DAPA has had less approval. And I guess I was just wondering, what are your thoughts about what the future of DAPA is? We know that essentially with the Trump administration, they had stopped pursuing reinstating DAPA, but do you think that is something that that could have a path forward with this new administration?
Yeah, you know, it's funny to watch the film now. It was such a heartbreaking story. You know, it felt like the Obama administration was committed and was really going to move forward in doing these things, both for the parents of undocumented people and also for the undocumented kids themselves. And that promise was sort of hanging there for so long. And I think you see how the strategy of sort of hamstringing the courts really just ended that opportunity. And I have high hopes for the Biden administration, honestly. You know, I think Biden is taking a much more, and he's more empowered because of the change in the legislative balance. You know, for the moment, he has 2 years to do a lot if he wants to do it, at least 2 years. And I hope he does. You know, I think a lot of people in the immigrant community were disappointed that he didn't do anything in the first 100 days, really. So I don't know if that signals a lack of commitment to this community or a focus on other priorities, you know, the pandemic clearly being one of them, economic stuff being another one. But I think it's hard to say. I have hopes, I have high hopes, also the environment being another piece, you know. I think there's so much to be done that maybe they're struggling, but it is disappointing at this point that hasn't been front and center. I don't know how you guys feel about that.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think part of it was even in the language, I think around DACA, a lot of politicians kind of frame DACA as, well, we don't want to punish kids for the crimes of their parents. And I feel like with DACA, there certainly is kind of a shifting of blame towards parents. And I think that is part of why it's difficult to garner the kind of political movement and the capital, the political capital to be able to move forward with something like DACA. Dawn asked in the chat, you mentioned that there was a Mexican historian that you worked with. If you could put his name in the chat box, or also maybe kind of speak more about your experiences working with this historian.
Yeah, so his name is Enrique Kraus. He wrote sort of the premier history of Mexico and also a number of profiles of leading figures both in Mexico and Latin America. And interestingly, he runs a television production company and a magazine called Clio, which some of you guys may have heard of. And when you watch the film, I think you can feel there's hopefully somewhat of a balance between the history and the contemporary story. But we all felt it was really important to try to understand the roots of what was happening. To me, the key points are, where you see that Mexican immigration had actually gone to zero and was negative during this whole hysteria about, migrants coming across the border. I think that's really revealing. I think the circular flow that was interrupted by fortifying the border is also really interesting because, for many years, people were just going back and forth, and it was a way to make a living. And of course, American business continues to use migrant labor to subsidize the profits that they're earning. So that system never shifted, but what shifted was the politics. And I think, to me, one of the big takeaways is just how much politics really plays a role in limiting, destroying, damaging lives in this case, and how, particularly during the last election, this community just became, as Doug Massey says, pawns. They really are political pawns. There aren't enough. I mean, interestingly, the majority of public opinion is for giving the Dreamers a pathway to citizenship. That's long been the case, and I think it remains the case. And yet, I think they've become too much of a political tool. I think if Trump runs again, it'll probably be anti-immigrant again. And you see how that it starts with the Mexican community, and then it expands to Muslim immigrants and to immigrants from all over the world. So I think it's one of those classic studies in how politicians can get a ball rolling and then really run with it, despite a lack of reality underneath it, and the way that then gets used to tar other communities. Proto-fascist, if not more so.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know Kayla had a question in the chat. I don't know if you wanted to unmute and ask. Okay, if not, she asked, would you be able to tell us more about the role of choosing voices for this documentary and the importance of storytelling rooted in the lived experiences of those experiencing the trauma of this inequitable political situation?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. The first story, Julissa Arce, we chose her really because she cuts across against the stereotypes of what you think is an undocumented immigrant, and I think the fact that she's polished and successful and was working in financial markets, and despite her accomplishments, still really had to struggle and ultimately, come to terms with the fact that she was undocumented, I think really offers an interesting lens for reassessing the contributions that migrants, particularly undocumented migrants, have. I think people more easily dismiss the work of Ishmael, who's painting houses and building doors. You say, well, that's just low-skilled labor, which it isn't. But when it comes to Julissa, it's harder just to dismiss her. So what we tried to do is sort of represent a variety of different statuses in the film also. So Jalissa is, the child of, is an undocumented child of immigrants. Ishmael and his family, his kids are American born, so they're American citizens. And I think as you look at the different characters, Isamar and her mom, again, against expectation, her mom is here legally, but Isamar isn't. And so I think part of what we came to understand is that the reality of immigrant families is that it's very complex, that there's a whole range of statuses often within one family. And so these issues connect and sort of cut across families and across communities and countries very, very powerfully. And so that was part of what we wanted to show. Also, the story of Isamar and her mom, Elia, and this transiting back and forth between Mexico every week, bringing gifts back and forth and connecting people who have been separated, I think was both very, very moving, but also, again, shows sort of the connections that exist, even when they're sort of invisible for most of us.
Yeah, and I think, I guess related to that point, my question is, I feel like documentation status is a very sensitive topic to be talking about. So I was wondering kind of logistically, if you had any challenges connecting with people and having them be able to tell their stories, or how you navigated being able to talk about something that is as sensitive as being undocumented.
I think when we were making the film 2014, 2015, early 2016, there was a real sense of hope that change was just around the corner. And a lot of people were really willing to stand up and to speak out. We're speaking out in their communities. We're speaking out publicly. I think interestingly, the gay rights movement, part of what some analysts say was its great success was showing people across the community, across the country, that there were gay people in every family and that there was these close connections. And a big part of that was having people come forward and identifying themselves as LGBT. And I think the immigrant rights community took a note from that very, very successful campaign, which ultimately led to the legalization of gay marriage, and really was a huge transformation in American public consciousness. I think the immigrant rights community took a note from that and said, look, if we really want to change our status, our situation, we have to change how Americans perceive of us. That's sort of where the Dreamer movement came from in large part. And as Lydia mentioned, there's some criticism of the Dreamers movement because they were presenting themselves as the good immigrants, the valedictorians, the smartest, the best, the brightest, the most successful, instead of representing that community as the face of their parents. But I think, again, they were pretty successful and nearly came very, very close to succeeding a number of times, really. But ultimately, they weren't able to push against the political current. But at the time of this film, when we were making it, people were willing to come forward. And I think even though there were risks associated with that, people were willing to take their stories because they felt the benefits of helping to change the public discourse were worth it. So there was a pretty open community at that point.
Okay, yeah, that's great to hear. And unfortunate things have kind of changed over the past years, but hopefully, like you mentioned, hopefully that hope is still kind of there and being able to be kindled. Kiala had another question, which is, what would you say is the call to action for this film, especially for those of us connected to health and healthcare?
Well, I think from the perspective of healthcare and public health, I mean, we stand in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and I think if you look at the numbers, I think American Indians, Hispanic, and African American communities are the hardest hit communities in the country, and that's clearly a reflection of racial disparities in access to healthcare and access to basic services. one of the constant themes in talking to people in the migrant community was how people don't go to doctors because they're afraid. They're afraid to interface with institutions, with official institutions, to be asked for documentation or to ask for insurance or all these questions. I think you also saw as they started to penalize people for being on welfare or being on public support or even Obamacare or whatever it was, that you had huge numbers of people just peeling out of these public services. And so I think clearly there's a real correlation between, immigration status within a family and health and longevity. I think it is a sensitive question to ask, but I think if you do ask it when you're working in these communities, I think it does offer a lens into those experiences. Isamar has a master's in social work, and she went into psychiatric counseling for particularly immigrant communities. And one of the things we've often talked about is just how profound the psychological damage is often for people in these communities and how that resonates across years and across generations. So I think there are really unique issues within these communities from a variety of healthcare perspectives. And, I think you could also argue that the overall health of the entire society can't be elevated if you ignore the most vulnerable, the poorest, those who are least protected, particularly in a time of a pandemic. I think that people have often said the pandemic is really revealing the cost of the inequities that exist so profoundly across our society. And, it's deeply harmful to everybody.
Yeah, I would agree. And, it's a good point about how obviously race and documentation status and ethnicity are tied to health access and thus health outcomes in that way. But I felt like one of the great quotes from the film was from Professor Massey, who said that it's just unhealthy for a democratic society to have so many people that are socially excluded and oppressed. And I felt like that kind of moved us to expand our definitions of health. And so I guess my question is, how do you think we can continue to move our definitions of health to center these issues and acknowledge that social inclusion is just inherently part of that definition?
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that bite from Doug Massey. Sadly, I think he was 100% right. I think over the last 4 years, you've seen an erosion of our democratic system in the most literal way. Even to the point now they're trying to exclude people from voting, right? Mostly minorities, mostly African-American communities. I think it is a sickness within democracy. I think once you allow the government to start scapegoating whole communities of people, as I think we said earlier, I think that's walking down the pathway towards fascism. I think Biden has a lot of water to carry to try to sort of brace up the democratic systems that we have. People across the country no longer believe in voting, that the voting system is now somehow unjust or unfair, right? I mean, the very basic ideas of what it means to be in a democratic society. They took the word immigrant off the Department of Homeland Security and off the Department of Immigration, right? I mean, there was an interesting article today, I was looking around a little bit, and one of the big changes is the ICE and affiliated departments can no longer use the word illegal. Now they have to use the word undocumented because the guy who came in to take control said language matters, words matter, how we talk about communities, how we define communities matter. And I think he's right. I think we've gotten very loose as a society and of course embattled. And to me, making this film, I think migrants were really, particularly Mexican migrants, were really the very first wave of the assault on our democratic system. And I don't know that we've improved much since then. So I'm interested in what you guys think. I mean, you're much closer to the ground on these issues right now than I am.
Yeah, I did not hear about that change in language, so I'll definitely have to look at the article. We do have a question from Ross. I'm not sure if Ross wants to unmute and ask.
Share that just in the.
Okay.
Sure, thanks. I can unmute it. Appreciate it. Very powerful film. I was seriously moved and appreciated your sharing, and also the way you weaved in the history of Mexicans and Americans, and the fact that part of Mexico is now part of America. The thing I wanted to kind of bring into the conversation is, I think this also can be shared with other groups. So one of the things I asked is, how can we access you in order to think about how to have conversations that may include you with other folks? Because I think the work, especially the walk across Selma, just really just talked about how the injustices in the United States are affecting many people.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to be involved in more conversations. Lydia has my email, and I can share my email also. This film is also available. It's streaming online for free also, so it's widely accessible. Yeah, I thought going on that march in Selma was really profound. Because again, the immigrant youth community really was drawing on the LGBT experience, but also very much on the African American civil rights tradition. And particularly explicitly nonviolent approach and how they're holding their rallies. And there's so much that is being drawn on in an attempt to mobilize American society. And I think those struggles are all very much interlinked. I think it's really a mistake to think of them as being separate, because that sort of plays into where the society is moving right now.
I agree 100%.
Yeah. Here,
Thank you so much.
Sure. No, thank you for your question.
We also have a question from Anne, if Anne wanted to unmute.
Sure, thanks, Lydia. Micah, I was wondering if you could speak a bit to the role documentary film plays in advocacy more generally. What are the aims? I can guess, obviously it's a tool to spread messages, but what are the aims? What's the theory of change behind making these films and trying to get them to reach audiences? And how do you, as a filmmaker, how do you assess whether those aims are achieved?
That's a great question. Early last year, I was part of a project at the University of Pennsylvania where they were using paid focus groups to look at different kinds of film clips and different kinds of storytelling to see what would result in opinion change most directly. And it was sort of the first really sort of metric-based kind of study that I've been part of for sure. And what they found is that if you embed stories in character, if you use a character-based approach where you're building context and community and showing these people not just on their own, but in relationship to their families or their partners or their communities, that actually had a much more powerful impact in changing actually how people perceived particular issues related to immigration. It's funny, I'm working on a project related to COVID right now. And we were talking about how science really can't defend itself against hysteria or against magical thinking, is the way we were talking about it earlier today. If you look at who doesn't want to get vaccinated right now in the United States, it tends to be African-American communities who have a legacy of being maltreated by the medical profession or the institutions. It's Native Americans, again, who have a history of deep mistreatment and lack of access to resources. And then it's white Republicans, particularly men, who have followed the lead of Donald Trump. And it seems like it should be obvious that being vaccinated is like a good thing for everybody. And yet there's so much, you guys know this, there's so much suspicion and so much, I think, they've just lowered in New Jersey the age to 16 because I guess people aren't getting vaccinated. I read a study, more than half of healthcare workers don't want to get vaccinated. You know, half of the firemen in the country don't want to get vaccinated. So I don't think that facts on their own can change attitudes and perspectives, I guess is really what I believe. I think facts are critically important. I think it's really critically important to be accurate and to be truthful and to be factual in the work that you do. But I think you have to frame that work in stories that are compelling if you want to actually achieve behavior change or attitude change or shift how people frame stories, right? You know, I have 2 young kids, teenagers now, and when I was working on the film, they were amazed that, you know, much of the American West was Mexico, right? And once you perceive that, that shifts you in a way that it's hard to shift back. So I think narrative storytelling, character, you know, I think is just such a powerful, rich way to engage people. And many of the films that I've done really use this kind of character-driven approach. It's interesting watching this film. This film was actually first cut as a feature film, so there were more characters, and the balance between the history and the characters was a little different. There was, in the end, more characters and less history. In this hour-long version that we made for PBS, you know, I think it's more half history, half characters, and I think it loses a little bit of the power, but yet the characters, I think, still really read through, at least to me. You know, Julissa, Raul, when Elia goes to Mexico and meets Don Raul's wife. I don't know if it was clear that was his wife, but I think there's so much emotional power in these visual scenes that I think it does have an impact. I think it does start to change attitudes, or at least that is my theory of change. But I am starting to see some empirical evidence that that in fact is true when you really do the research. So
thanks. I really appreciate the comment and your mention of the study. I think in the School of Public Health, we've seen increasingly, of course, in the last year, how important the voices of many of our colleagues and faculty are in combating some of this hysteria. But I think what's really come through is that the methodology of communication of facts is more than just the facts, just as you've highlighted. So I really appreciate those comments.
Yeah, I saw an article recently that said one of the big changes that COVID has wrought in the United States, at least, if not elsewhere, is it's recentered science and scientists into the spokespeople. You know, most scientists are so cautious. You know, the standard of proof and academic scholarship being, you know, certainty. But as somebody said to me recently, in a pandemic, you have to work at pandemic speed, and part of the response has to accept a certain amount of uncertainty, right? If you wait till you're certain, as with the variants creeping across the country, then perhaps it's too late, right, to respond effectively. And that may be part of the position of science and scientists and you guys is to be more preemptive and, you know, and use all the tools at your disposal. And, you know, public health communications, I think, is critical. It's just so important. You know, and you've probably seen the studies, you know, in the hierarchy of things that people take seriously, their own health is really at the top of that list. I worked for a number of years in climate change issues with Al Gore's Climate Reality Project. And, you know, in the early days of trying to get people to become more conscious and more aware of the changes going on, one of the things we did was to look at how human health is being impacted. And, you know, it was a little more subtle 7 or 8 years ago. I think now it's really evident, you know, whether that's, you know, equine encephalitis moving north from Mexico, or whether it's, you know, I mean, you can see the different infectious agents sort of moving as the temperatures shift, as the range of the species shift. So I don't know, I think people's health is really one of the most powerful appeals for behavior change you could possibly make. And so you guys can leverage that, I think, because I think everybody cares, unless you don't, in which case you don't get vaccinated. I don't know, that's a conundrum I don't really understand at the moment. But Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I think kind of related to that, your lecture, and I was wondering if you had any advice for people who were interested in exploring whether it be filmmaking or just storytelling in general, in connecting that to their work. If you could just, yeah, if you had any advice or some crash course tips in terms of being able to.
You know, I've come to think that visual media is really, really, really the dominant form of communication at this moment. And so I think in addition to your epidemiological classes and your public health classes and the medical stuff that you're doing, you know, it really wouldn't hurt to take a social media class or to take a media production class, you know, just to at least become familiar with some narrative techniques, with how do you tell stories, you know, how to write better stories, how to illustrate stories. Maybe it's photography, you know, picture literally is worth 1,000 words. You know, all these, you know, there's a lot to be learned about how to frame and shape stories, and then how do you embed the behavior change or the ideas that you want to, you know, I think public health people are by definition interested in storytelling and behavior change. I think otherwise, you know, you probably wouldn't become what you've become. You know, and you're trying to tell stories at both population levels and at individual levels. And, you know, it was Stalin who said, you know, 1 death is a tragedy, 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic. And I think he was right. You know, it's the personal, the intimate, the unique, the specific really has a lot of power to engage people. So I think the more skills that you can accumulate in that direction, perhaps the more effective you'll be at a moment like this where it's all about communication. You know, look at poor Governor Whitmer out in Michigan, right? She's been intimidated to the point where she can't even close down her state anymore, right? Because a different narrative has taken control in Michigan, and the freedom argument is now. I don't know if you guys saw the exchange between Fauci and that senator or that congressman who will be unnamed, but you know, it was an argument between public health and freedom, right? And I think you have to be pretty savvy to help to navigate through that in a way that more people don't end up dying just because somebody keeps screaming freedom, you know, liberty, taking away our liberties to go to church, liberties to, you know, how can you close down the country? I don't know. I think storytelling is really at the heart of much of this. And I think Fauci is a master storyteller, you know, and a master politician. But I think there's a reason he's become such a main public voice. And again, isn't it amazing that Anthony Fauci is, you know, the main public voice on COVID? You know, appropriate probably, but not inevitable. And I think he's learned a lot about media and how to present himself to the media. You know, he was raked through the coals during HIV/AIDS. You know, he was the devil for a lot of the activist community for many years. But, you know, part of his transformation is he embraced that community and started telling stories with them together. And that changed how HIV/AIDS was researched and the medications were developed across the country and the world. And now he's trying to take that into COVID. So, you know, he's a very interesting character to study in his own evolution of how he's managed to learn to relate to the media and the public health sphere. Sorry, long answer for sure.
No, yeah, thank you for highlighting the importance of storytelling. And I agree. I feel like we are in public health and we are inadvertently, whether we know it or not, involved in storytelling. So it's great to kind of think about how to incorporate that more into our own work. I just wanted to offer one last chance if there's any final questions that people wanted to ask. If not, I did want to give Micah the opportunity to kind of highlight anything that's that you're currently working on, or you did provide your email, so hopefully people can get in touch with you. But if there's anything you want us to kind of be on the lookout for, any projects that are upcoming.
I'm working on a COVID project, but I'm actually not allowed to talk about it.
Okay.
But, you know, I think public health people are heroes. You know, you guys have the ability to change and to save not 1 or 1,000, but millions of lives. And at this point, you guys are being thrust onto the front lines of communication and media and understanding and interpreting all that's going on around us. So if you guys come across any good stories, let me know. Maybe we can work together. Yeah.
Thank you again so much for taking the time to speak with us and sharing your insights. Yes, we do have a lot of events planned for this week that Kyla put in the chat, so feel free to join us. And I also want to give a quick shout out and thank you to Tony, Kyla, and Ezot for all of their work to help bring this together for National Volunteer Week. And with that, I think I could wish you all a good night and thank you all for joining us.
Great. Thank you, everybody. It's great talking with you.
Thanks so much, Micah. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Great job, Lydia.
Thank you. Night.
Good night.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.